Could I get everybody to get their seat so we can get this meeting started on time, or relatively on time?
Just pound the gap.
Yeah. My name's Dick Beard. I'm Vice Chairman of the Budget and Finance Committee, and Governor Perez is not able to be here in person. He is on the telephone, but I'm going to be your official chair at this point, and he's going to fill in at any time you'd like, Governor Perez.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for filling in. I apologize I can't be there. I think I'm paying the price for 10 days in Brazil with the Boy Scouts. Don't drink the water.
Well, I hope you had a good time. If I could, Mikey, would you like to call the roll, please?
Will do. Governor Duncan?
Here.
Governor Hosseini? I know he's here.
Yeah.
Governor Marshall?
Here.
Governor Rood?
Here.
Governor Tripp?
Here.
Governor Franklin? Here. You have a full quorum.
Great. In your packets, the minutes from the November meeting are there. Does anybody have any comments or comments as it relates to the minutes of those minutes? If there are no comments, can I have a motion to approve them? The November meeting minutes?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Aye. Okay, thank you very much. The majority of this meeting is going to be taken up by our financial aid workshop. We've got multiple presenters today. We want this meeting to be interactive between the board and the presenters, so if you've got any questions of the presenters, please don't be shy, and I know you won't be, and please ask any questions. We have today the University Financial Aid Directors, and if you don't mind, I would appreciate it if those directors that are here that will participate in this workshop would introduce yourselves so we get to know you. Yes. Thank you, Mary.
Karen Folks, University of Florida.
Good to see you.
Daryl Marshall, Florida State University.
Good to see you, Daryl. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here and making this trip. Please participate as you would like to. This workshop is the board's opportunity to learn about the various complexities of financial aid, which in the future, as tuition moves upward, which it, as we all know, will, is going to become more and more important to the students at this system. And my understanding is that every now and then there are some federal programs that because of the way the system's structured, we sometimes don't fully use. So I'd like to go ahead and start the meeting with Mary Beth Ehas. Mary Beth, would you get us kicked off?
Yes, I'm very happy to do so. I am Vice President for Student Development and Enrollment Services at the University of Central Florida, and it's my pleasure to serve as the chair of the Council of Student Affairs, my counterparts at the rest of the institutions. And I really just have 2 or 3 slides to share with you this afternoon. The first one that is there, that is up on the screen, really refers to all those groups, all those institutions that have some part in this financial aid puzzle. My hope in this 2 minutes that I'm up here is really to just have an overview, a very simple introduction. The detail is going to come. But it's not any one part of the puzzle. Federal government, state of Florida, our board and policies, each of our institutions, families, parents, and the individual students. And you might even add community agencies, philanthropic organizations. There are many players in this puzzle. One of the things that occurs for families, as you can imagine, is lack of awareness about all the players, all the different ways that a package of financial aid can support a student's education. It's very well documented in the literature that without these subsidies from the federal government and from the state, we would have less access and less success of our students in higher education. This slide really puts money at the center of it all. Although finances and financial support are not the only indicators of success by any means, they certainly are deterrents if there isn't enough financial support. I put these different categories in this sort of a circular way because the student experience and the financial aid that supports that experience is not one-dimensional. Many aspects of a student's career are affected and impacted by lack of funding or lack of financial support. The student experience begins with our institutions way before a student begins taking classes. It never really ends either, because the kind of experience that a student has, the ease that they have, and the support that they have going through our programs makes them strong and effective alumni as well as contributors in the workforce. Messages to parents and students about ways to finance higher education, especially to low-income families, makes a difference on whether a student and a family even consider the idea that higher education is an option for their son or daughter. That's the awareness piece. The idea that there is a package that's put together and there's not just one source is something that's fairly difficult and very important to communicate with families way before they actually are deciding to apply to an institution. In fact, recruitment is a major reason, a major source of, a major outcome, I guess I would say, of what we offer to students in terms of financial support. And as you'll see later in this presentation, we often cannot meet the need by the sources that we have available to us. But a student may not even consider going to a particular institution because they would not be very close to how would they possibly support themselves or how could they possibly be successful there. So a student may self-select out of even contending or thinking about a particular institution. There is some information in the literature that high-ability students, especially those with need, may underestimate where they can best be successful because they think they cannot afford it. So a student moves on and selects an institution, and we sometimes forget, and we see this in our entire division in many areas. We forget that as a student progresses through their educational career, they have the same concerns, the same issues as far as funding their education as when they started their educational career. And unfortunately, often we don't think about how do we help a student progress, which forces the student to really go outside of the areas that were mentioned in the first slide and probably work more than they really need to or can afford to be successful. So money matters. It matters at every stage of a student's experience. A student who doesn't have their need met will often be forced to work more hours than really they can afford to work to be successful at the institution. Let's not forget that financial need or the lack of financial resources does create stress, which does affect and impact student success. Clearly, we have all seen in our institutions that the changes in Bright Futures were real and they impacted enrollment for students. Many families were not prepared for the extra expenses that they now needed to incur, And students had to make decisions about whether they continued school and were successful or maybe dropped back in their hours because they had to work more, and they made choices not to continue. We saw that in our institution this past year. The economy, interestingly, is really the source of why we in our institutions have to raise tuition, have to increase fees in order to support our work. At the same time, families their income is not increasing, and there is a greater need for financial aid and financial resources. This issue of balancing work and education constantly is in a way, a thorn in the educational process. Sometimes work can be a real focus, a real way for a student to manage their time, but too much work really gets in the way of success. I had a conversation just this past week with a new transfer student coming from one of our consortium community colleges. She was coming to UCF as a result of our Direct Connect program. She had been working part-time while she was finishing her 2-year degree. Now that she was coming to UCF, she's interested in working on our campus and asked where there might be some possibilities, which working on campus is a much better resource, a much better option than working off campus. It's a way to connect, and it also cuts down on extra time. When I asked her how many hours she was thinking about working without stopping, she said 30 hours. I said, well, that's probably not anything that we're going to be able to provide for you, and in fact, I'm going to caution you against doing that. But she was concerned about the amount of loans that she and her parents were going to need to take out to allow her to finish her education. And so I think these are the kinds of balancing acts that we see in our students all the time. Basic support needs. Students now are experiencing, and we are seeing, needs for food, needs for resident. All of our institutions are seeing that we're running into students that cannot take care of basic needs. Either they didn't apply for financial aid before they started at the institution, or their situation with themselves or their parents have changed. So we have set up a pantry, a food pantry at our institution. I think Florida State also has a food pantry as well. And it's a very important source of support for our students. So the point, I guess, that I'm trying to make is there's many players, there's many issues that impact financial aid at all stages of a student's career, and lack of financial support causes stress and impacts the student's success. So let me turn over the program to Dr. Dan Cohen-Vogel from the Board of Governors, and he'll help you with specifics.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dan.
I was waiting. Thank you. I'll go ahead and start, and then hopefully the presentation will be up in just a sec. There it is.
Good afternoon, Dan.
Thank you. What I want to do is to try and lay out the landscape of what sort of financial aid looks like in the university system, how much there is, where it comes from, what the basic process is for going from those sources to getting aid to students. We have, as Mr. Beard pointed out, a number of financial aid directors here. A couple of them will be presenting in a little while, and so if there are questions about more specifics, they may provide that, as well as the others can provide different perspectives from their institutions if that helps. Just to frame it, there are some board regulations already in place that deal with financial aid, and most prominently the Student Financial Aid Regulation, which just lays out the expectations of regulations that boards of trustees would adopt relating to various aspects of administering and distributing financial aid. We also have specific financial aid components of tuition fees regulations, specifically related to the tuition differential, 30% of which must go to need-based aid for undergraduates. That regulation also talks about the process for monitoring compliance with non-supplanting provisions of that statute, and then another regulation that deals with the financial aid fee, which mirrors the statute. The financial aid fee is can be up to 5% of tuition. I believe it is at all the institutions 5% of tuition, and at least 75% of that must go to need-based aid. So I'm going to focus primarily on undergraduate aid. That's where most of your questions have come from, and the discussions about tuition policy in terms of the portion of tuition policy the board handles deal primarily with undergraduate tuition differential and its contributions to undergraduate financial aid. This is a picture of financial aid, so the distribution of where the different sources of financial aid are or were in 2009-10. And you can see that the biggest portion of this pie is the loans. These are primarily federal loans, and that represents the amount of essentially student loans that were taken by undergraduates in that year. If you take that piece out of it, you can see that federal aid, which is primarily the federal Pell Grant program, is the biggest block. The Pell Grant program has grown somewhat in recent years. I'll touch on that in just a minute. It represents almost $400 million in undergraduate aid, or the overall federal aid. There are other programs. State aid is close behind. The bulk of that, a little over $300 million, was from Bright Futures, and a little under $50 million of it was from the state's need-based program, which is the Florida Student Assistance Grant Program, and some other state programs as well, such as the First Generation Matching Grant and some others that you may be less familiar with, the smaller programs. A smaller portion is from private sources, and by private here, these are awards that come from, you may be familiar with a local Kiwanis or a local education foundation that provides funding directly to students. This is the portion of that kind of private aid that the financial aid offices are aware of and report to us. And these are really pass-through dollars. It's not something that is affected by either our policies or state policy, but awards that students bring to help support their cost of education. And the piece that might be of most interest, and the part that your actions with regard to whether it's tuition and fee policy or otherwise may affect the most, is institutional aid. In that year, there was a little over $150 million of institutional aid given to undergraduate students. That aid comes from various sources, from the tuition differential fee, the 30% of the tuition differential, from the financial aid fee, 75% of which goes to need-based aid, from the direct appropriation. For many years, there's been a specific appropriation in the Appropriations Act that goes to financial aid. I believe last year it was around $17 or $18 million. And that as well has a provision in proviso language that 75% would go to need-based aid. There's private money, either donors directly to colleges that might have a particular award to go to get an education degree or a music degree, and from university foundations that provide support in the form of scholarships and grants to students. And then other institutional funds can contribute as well, for example, tuition dollars. There have been a lot of changes in recent years, and maybe some coming changes that are worth being aware of as you look at these kinds of policies, as you look at the financial aid and potential policies, I should say. Federal and state programs have been evolving, and there are some changes that are continuing to happen. The Pell Grant, which is the big federal program, has been ramped up quite a bit in recent years. It is approaching, I believe, a peak of $5,500 maximum award, and then will be indexed to inflation. That's a significant increase in just a few years. And we've seen that in terms of the amount of money that our students are getting. Individual students who qualify, their awards are going up. I believe it was around the order of $700, $800 per student increase over just a few years. On the other side, the SMART and ACG programs, which are much smaller and focused federal financial aid programs, are going away as this increase in Pell is being phased in. Those programs, while overall don't account for a big portion of federal aid, for the students getting them can be fairly generous, and so can have an impact on individual students who would have otherwise qualified for them. In the course of these changes to the programs, we've also had a change in the federal formula. You may have heard some discussion in recent years about simplifying the federal application process, or simplifying the federal formula. And that simplification that's occurred has resulted in considerably more students qualifying for need-based aid, qualifying for Pell Grants. So as we've seen both the award amount going up, we've also seen the number of students qualifying for that award go up. And then at the state level, Dr. E has referred to the changes in Bright Futures. There have been a number of changes both in the programmatic and in terms of the cost to that program. Those are sort of efficiency kind of focused changes, such as reducing the amount of hours it covers from 110% of the students' hours for the degree down to 100%, increase in the requirements for hours to renew the scholarship, and changes that are being phased in over the coming few years, a significant rise in the SAT cutoff, the test score cutoff to qualify for the program initially. All of those combined will likely result in a significant number of students who would have, under the formal rules, qualified, not qualifying for the Bright Futures Award. In addition to those changes to the program and the eligibility requirements, there have been changes in the award, something that was talked about for many years. The legislature made significant change in changing the award from a percentage of tuition and fees. The two award levels were 75% and 100% of tuition and fees formerly, to a flat rate award, which is now what was formerly the 100% level. The academic scholars is now $125 a credit hour. And at the medallion level of what was formerly 75% of tuition and fees is now a $95 a credit hour award. So those were significant changes, both in terms of how that program will move over time and in terms of cost to the state. It also affects the students receiving the award, and that as tuition goes up, that per credit hour rate won't necessarily rise with tuition. At the institutional level, the institutional programs are affected by a variety of factors. Tuition differential, which has gone up, is now still a relatively small part of the overall institutional aid picture, but has the potential to contribute quite a bit more over time. The financial aid fee has typically gone up in tandem with tuition, so should the legislature take action on the portion of tuition the legislature sets, that would add to the revenues from financial aid fee, which now contributes I believe close to $60 million to the overall financial aid picture at the both undergraduate and graduate level. That direct appropriation has gone down in recent years and may go up or down in the future. And the economy has affected both private giving and foundation endowments, so that all those things combined have been limitations or additions to financial aid at the institutional level in recent years. So what I want to do is just take a few minutes to lay out some of the kind of basic building blocks of the financial aid picture. And then the financial aid experts here will have a little more detail to add in terms of how the process works for different kinds of students at different institutions. This is an average. I'll kind of take a representative student here, a full-time resident undergraduate in Florida, pays on average about $4,900 this year in tuition and fees overall. That can vary a few $100s either way. Local fees, athletic, health, transportation vary. Tuition differentials not uniform across the institutions, but in general it's around $4,900 or so. This pie will show kind of the breakdown of what that looks like. Right now, tuition differential is about 10% of that, give or take. Tuition is about 59%, and those other fees account for another 31% of that overall pie. So in terms of decisions that you might have to make in the future, the pieces that this board might potentially weigh in on would be the tuition differential and some of those other fees. Fees and tuition are not the overall picture that a financial aid office looks at when it figures out how to meet students' needs. They're looking at the overall cost of attendance. The block on the left shows what that cost of attendance is typically for a state university in Florida. The $4,900 tuition and fees, plus the other costs, room and board, books, transportation, and so forth. come to close to $18,000 a year when we look at the overall cost for a full-time student. These can vary by institution, based on the cost of living, the dormitories, some of the assumptions folks make about whether or not a student needs a computer starting out, or how much transportation is reasonable to allot. But this is pretty close to what most institutions are. And if you look at the comparison between that and the national average, we kind of developed this picture of the institutions in our system before we went and looked at the national average, and it turned out, I've shown them here exactly the same. The national average numbers were almost the same from a recent College Board report, within a couple $100 either way. Nationally, room and board for a public university is around $8,500, and those other costs were pretty close, within $100 or two. And so the real difference, the major difference between Florida's cost and many other states' costs is tuition and fees. And nationally, a public university is about $2,600, $2,700 higher than Florida in its average tuition and fees. Now, this College Board report, and every year the College Board does a trends in college pricing, which not only tracks these basic costs and the tuition, and also tracks sort of what's going on with the net price that students pay. How much tuition is going up relative to how much financial aid is going up to cover that tuition. And what was interesting about their report this year is they talked about how, while we've seen this upward trend nationally in tuition and fees, we've seen a fairly consistent kind of parallel trend in financial aid, so that overall nationally the net price, at least the tuition and fees portion, hasn't changed much over the last few years. So once the financial aid office has a picture of a student's budget or their cost, they got to figure out how to meet some or all of those needs. And that starts with determining the student's ability to pay. And the way that we determine the student's ability to pay is through this federal aid application, which is called the FAFSA. And it's used to calculate an expected family contribution, which is called the EFC. And it really just represents a family's ability to pay, how much annually they can contribute to their child's education, how much annually that student can contribute to their own education, depending on whether they're a dependent or independent filer. This EFC, this ability to pay, is then used to determine the need that student has and the eligibility of that student's eligibility for federal and state need-based programs and for some institutional need-based programs. So once we have the cost of attendance, which was about $18,000 a year, and I'm just going to use an EFC of $3,000 as an example, then the net need is the cost of attendance minus that EFC. In this example, it's $15,000. A $3,000 EFC roughly corresponds to a student in our system in the sort of $40,000 to $50,000 income range or at least a lot of students in that range would roughly be in that $3,000 EFC. So this picture is sort of the starting point of our building those blocks to meet the student's need. There's the expected family contribution of about $3,000, and there's tuition and fees and the other costs, and that's what the financial aid office is addressing when they start packaging aid. This is what the picture ends up looking like, and I'm going to kind of explain each of these in turn. We build different sources of financial aid, as well as what we might call what's called self-help, to build the overall package. So starting with federal aid, the student's EFC determines their eligibility for Pell Grants or other federal need-based awards. In this case, the Pell Grant for a student with this $3,000 EFC was roughly $2,500. So they qualified for what's a little less than half of a maximum Pell Award, and that's added on top of that EFC. As I pointed out, those Pell Grants have gone up over time, and we would expect to see this block look a little bit larger next year for this same student as that award level, the maximum award level, goes up a little bit.
Is there any restriction on what a Pell Grant can be used by the student?
I don't believe so.
They do have to certify they're using it for educational purposes, but it could be tuition or for living expenses.
state aid on top of the federal aid. In this case, we're using a student who would have had, let's say, a medallion level Bright Futures Award and maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000 more from the state's need-based program, the FSAG program. So this student would have been getting this year $95 a credit hour from Bright Futures, plus some additional money from the need-based program, and that would be added on top of this award. Yes, sir.
Can you remind on Bright Future, what's the minimum to start and how does it go up? What grade point average do you have to have?
The medallion level, which is what used to be the 75% level, the minimum GPA in high school was at 3.0, and the minimum SAT score was at 970. That's being phased up to, I believe, 1050 over the next few years. Is that correct? I believe it's going up about 80 points at the minimum over the next few years. So that in this case, while this student, if he qualified now and 3 years from now would have the same amount of money, assuming the appropriation stays the same, we'll see fewer students being able to add that on top of their other aid sources because there'll be fewer qualifying.
And then above that is if you have a 3.5?
Yes, the 3.5 and 1270 was the cutoff for the academic, the higher level scholarship, and I believe that 1270 is going up 30 or 40 points. I don't know if, no?
I don't know.
Oh. So it's not going up as much as the medallion level, but I don't remember exactly.
What about the GPA? What's the GPA has to be?
I think it's staying at 3.5.
3.5.
Yes.
And then when is it that you get at 100%?
That would have been the 100% level before the award was changed to a flat rate per credit hour. Now it's at $125 a credit hour.
Okay. So the 100% is just changed is just per credit hour,
Yes.
flat number.
And to put, yes,
Does that cover the cost of the tuition?
the 125 a credit hour is roughly 75, somewhere in 75 to 80% of typical tuition and fees for a full-time student now.
So how does it, when somebody gets a Pell Grant and a Bright Future, so they're getting over 100%?
Of tuition only.
Right, on
Yes,
tuition.
so they'd be getting over 100% of tuition and fees in this case, but they'd have, in this picture, an additional $9,000 or $10,000 to make up on the other costs of attendance.
Mr. Chair, I don't want to bog down on the issue of Bright Futures. There'll be plenty of time to talk about it, but it really is important that we emphasize what Governor Hussaini has been alluding to. There's been a massive change in Bright Futures. Those who at one point suggested that Bright Futures was writing the ticket for huge numbers of students in the state of Florida and were partially true, that's changed dramatically. It has now been totally decoupled from tuition increase in that it is now a flat award, and if tuition goes up 15% this year, Bright Futures remains the same. The only change in that would be an additional appropriation by the legislature. I've said for years, that's never going to happen, largely because once it's fixed, the money that used to go there will go somewhere else, and the chances of it ever coming back are slim and none. So my point here is that as tuition increases year after year, the net effect is that Bright Futures will have less and less a positive impact on student financial assistance over the years to come. The only way that can be resolved is if more money is added by the legislature to the Bright Futures amount. So this relieves what a number of people thought were the greatest problems with Bright Future. Number one, the runaway cost. With the increase in standard to get a Bright Future scholarship, you're going to see less people qualifying. Now, that doesn't mean that new people might not qualify over time as our population continues to grow. But many of the same people who at one time had qualified will no longer qualify at the lower standard. And then two, probably the greatest knock on Bright Futures was the fact that we weren't raising tuition at appropriate rates because every time tuition went up, the amount going into Bright Futures had to go up to compensate. That no longer is the case. It is now a fixed amount of money. It is no longer 75% of or 100% of. It is for both awards going to be a higher standard to get it, and it will be over time a lesser amount of money that is not tied to any tuition increase, if that makes sense. And I'm dwelling on that because there still persists. I run into it in the legislature all the time, since so many of these changes were made late in the legislative process or were made without a great deal of fanfare to average folks. It's still pretty extraordinary how many people in the legislative process aren't aware that for the most part, the issues that Bright Futures were conveyed to be having for the system have been resolved and will grow over time in their resolution based on the increase in tuition, which is going to be a natural fact of life, and the fixed amount variable of the Bright Future Scholarship. So that is a very important part of this conversation, and I thank you, Governor, for asking the question.
Just another comment. Is it not true, though, that the need-based scholarship funds that we have to deal with today are growing to make up some of that gap?
Ironically, on the flip side of that, with differential tuition and the 30% requirement, as tuition goes up, the amount of money that the institutions are contributing to needs-based financial assistance will go up as well. Now, part of that theory blows up because the tuition is going up, so the theory is you will perhaps at many institutions need more money to meet that obligation, but it is true that as we increase tuition, over time again, the amount of money that will be going into needs-based will grow. Dan, you did, I think, an estimate for me one day or Tim, as to where the total pot of needs-based financial assistance generated through that 30% might be if we raised our tuition over a period of time. And I'm putting you on the spot. Maybe it was Tim Jones, but it was a significant increase in the total amount of needs-based financial assistance generated as a result of someone, for example, who might have already been going to 15%, who goes 15% just for the next 2 to 3 years across the system. When you total it, it's a rather remarkable amount of money when you consider we were at 0 in that category at one point as a state, where we're going to be as tuition continues to increase.
And to give you some perspective on the magnitude of that, to answer your question, the first year, I guess last year that the tuition differential was in place, it generated around $11 or $12 million for financial aid for undergraduates, so a little less than 10% of that slice of the pie. As both the rates went up and the number of students who were exempt because they were grandfathered in has gone down, in this year that will be roughly almost double, roughly $23 million or so toward that institutional aid piece, and those should it go up again would continue to add significant amounts over time to the pot.
Dan, could I ask one more question too? Historically, the percentage of high school graduates who qualified for one of the Bright Futures versus where that is now, do you have any kind of feeding for that?
I have seen analysis by there's a legislative research unit that's done some of that. It's a little bit dated, but the cutoffs, at least the medallion level in the SAT, I believe in their research was in the range of a 25 to 30% of medallion level students not qualifying who would have qualified before.
But any idea what the percentage of students who qualified for one of the two programs before these new changes took place? Half the high school graduates, or? It was
approaching 35% of high school graduates in recent years. I don't know what it is now.
Okay, and presumably that fraction is going to go down as the standards go up. Okay.
How many students are on Bright's Futures in the system, I wonder, compared to how many we have?
Overall, when you take into account, as a percentage of our FTICs, it's been around 80% in recent years of incoming freshmen. But when we count transfers and all the different students, it's hovered around the low 40s, 45% of all the undergraduates who have a Bright Futures Award. And I would expect that to go down some in the coming years.
Is that because their grades don't stand, or why do they lose the scholarship?
I wasn't clear.
Yeah.
So of the incoming freshmen, it's a much higher percentage.
Right.
typically because the students who come in as FTICs, as freshmen, came out of high school with a little bit higher performance than the ones on average who went the 2+2 path. So when you average in all the students, as well, that roughly 75% of them retain their award over time. So about a quarter of them end up not having the grades or the hours to renew. So that combination leads to about 45% who actually have it at any point. So the next block is institutional aid. I've left off the private here. A student might have come with something from the Kiwanis or the local education foundation. I didn't add it in just for brevity. The institutional piece to this student, in this case, we've given this representative student another $1,500 institutional award. In the coming years, as we said, if differential goes up, we would expect this perhaps to go up some. If tuition goes up, it might add, some additional financial aid fee dollars that would be directed, but all those factors that affected financial aid would affect those programs the institution has that are getting money to the student. I think right now, about 45% from our recent numbers of all the institutional programs, all the different programs institutions manage to get aid to students are need-based programs, about the dollars, I should say, are coming from need-based programs. Another helpful way to look at it, though, because there tend to get a lot of questions about need versus non-need based programs, in the same breath we're talking about how much we're addressing the needs of students, and they're slightly different issues. We address the needs of low-income students, as Dr. Ehaz was talking about, through Bright Futures, which is not a need-based program. At the institutional level as well, we might have a program that gives an award to a student because of their high-performing arts ability or something else that ends up meeting a need that would have otherwise had to be addressed through need-based programs. This picture kind of breaks it up without regard for what the purpose of the program is, but rather what the result is for students. The students for whom we have income data are those who've applied for aid, so we're assuming most of those students have some need that needs to be met. And this gives, and the ones that we did not apply for aid also get some awards because they're getting not just need-based but merit-based programs. Roughly half of the students, 51%, getting institutional aid have incomes of under $50,000 a year. And roughly 70% of the students, a little more, have come from families or have family incomes of under $100,000 a year. So this gives you a sense of kind of who the aid is going to by the income groups they come from, and also the percentage of our students getting aid who aren't applying for any kind of need-based award or are going after loans. So that kind of makes up the aid portion of this picture, and the last block on top is what I've kind of dubbed self-help plus unmet need. And self-help refers to loans and work. And a financial aid office will typically package some expectation of loans and or work that the student is essentially help themselves through those two means to make up a piece of the aid picture. That might be 30, 35, 40% of the overall cost that needs to be met. And so when I've been asked questions about how much need is out there, how much unmet need is out there, the question is always sort of it depends, because it sort of depends on your assumptions about how much self-help we expect of students. Philosophically, we might expect that everybody contribute some amount of self-help. And in fact, even the most generous national programs, Princeton, Harvard, Emory, that have some very generous sort of programs to guarantee limited loans or no loans to students, will still include in that package $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year of earnings from wages on top of that expected family contribution. And that's the portion that the students expected to help themselves with. Whatever is not part of that self-help in this equation would be the unmet need. And so when we try and calculate some estimate of unmet need, it can be anywhere from $50 million to $250 million for the system, depending on how we define that self-help piece. And so I hope at least that answers the basic question some of you had about that concept, and if we have more, we can do more detailed analysis with different scenarios.
Mr. Chair, how much availability is there within the universities for student jobs and to help a student meet those needs?
I think I'd have to defer to Karen or Mary or one of the other financial aid directors perhaps could answer that question better than I.
We've got, at the University of Florida last year, we had about 4,700 students working on campus in part-time jobs. However, we've got a lot of students that are working in the local community as well, in the mall in particular, the stores at the mall, and in the restaurants and the service industry, and I'm sure that's probably even higher in some of our more urban areas.
So do you have any students that want to work 15 hours a week, or whatever the number you tell me is an appropriate hour for a full-time student to work, that can't get a job at your university?
If they can't get a job, it's usually because their course schedule doesn't fit the requirements of the jobs. But for the most part, we can find a job for a student on campus who wants one, who may be willing to work an odd shift or something like that. Work study, which is the federal financial aid, that's constrained by the amount of money we get from the federal government. We can only put so many people on the work study program because that's all the money we've got.
And one last question. Since your student population is probably wealthier than the other university student populations, what would the University of Central Florida, University of West Florida, or do you have enough jobs on your campus to give students or?
Employed on our campus, we have approximately about 400 students who are working, and that includes work study and what we know of the students who are working on other departments on campus. No, that is not enough jobs to adequately support all the students who either need to work or desire to work. And like Karen said, we're restricted by primarily most of those students who are employed that we know of are working with federal work study dollars. And so we're restricted because of the number of dollars that we receive from the Department of Education.
One other question. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that the universities are obligated to find a job for every student. I think if we've got the jobs, we ought to be providing them to students. But there are other places in the marketplace for people to go to work. I know I did the whole time I was in school. But Ava, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I wanted to ask Karen a question. So is there any way to quantify the number of students who are interested in working on campus but can't find jobs, really?
I don't have any data on that. We don't run into a lot of students who said, I've looked for a job and can't find one. More the case, we offer them work and they said that they'd rather work out in the community and turn the job offer down.
So then if I know, I guess I'm aware of students at UF who had work, who were able to find jobs on campus, let's say last semester, and been unsuccessful this semester. Where do I send them when they're, for these opportunities that may be available to them?
Well, we do an online job posting. We have a job board that lists every department that has a job opening, and there's always job openings, although the student may not fit what it is they're looking for. But a student who has difficulty finding a job can actually come in and talk to our employment counselors in the financial aid office, and they'll actually work with the student one-on-one to find positions on campus. There are some students for whom we can't place. They have very restricted hours or child care issues or whatever. But we'll work with the student to help them find a job. It depends a lot on the economy and the departments, how much money the departments have to hire. Some years are better than others in terms of the number of people that they can afford to employ.
But right now there are positions that are going that are not filled.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Dan, continue, please.
That's the extent of my comments, Mr.
Okay.
Chair.
Good.
Dr. Barron is here to share some research that his campus has done, and following him, there's some financial aid directors with some more specifics about some of the questions you've been asking. Thank you.
Okay, and I want to make sure that I say this is a FSU perspective. Every university is slightly different, and let's see if I go to the next one. Do I operate this?
You're asking the wrong person.
Okay, and I'm going to provide some context, including some discussion about tuition as well as financial aid. And hopefully you won't think that I've stepped off track. I just want to make sure that we see this as kind of a balancing act that we're trying to do. So first I have the totals for FSU financial aid. It's almost $53 million for Bright Futures and $32.5 million for other grants and scholarships, almost $29 million for Pell, some contributions from departments and waivers. I don't tend to add loans when I'm making this discussion, even though nationally you look at this as part of financial aid, because I view it as somebody paying for that portion. So I'm just going to focus on that part, which are basically true scholarships. And the idea here is that we have a certain amount of tension between the amount of resources that we have and accessibility. Low overall costs and greater financial aid equals greater accessibility. And I must admit that coming here from universities in 2 other states, our legislature deserves a great compliment for what they've done to promote accessibility. It's very clear to me that Bright Futures has worked perhaps beyond anybody's expectations in keeping very bright students in state, which they then tend to work in, and keeping tuition and fees at a bargain compared to much of the U.S. And, you know, from our point, Florida State got listed as a budget Ivy this year and ranked in Princeton Review as the 4th best choice in the nation in terms of affordable quality, and U.S. News and World Report just came out we were 20. The challenge, of course, is to fund higher education when you have budget
Eric?
cuts. Yeah?
Yeah, Madam Chairman.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
You say a budget Ivy. What institution or entity?
So the Fisk report for higher education lists institutions by which they have a number of different monikers, and one of them is you match up on quality, but you're inexpensive. This is the budget Ivy category. So it was nice to be called a budget Ivy.
And is FISC an acronym for something, or that is the actual?
No, it's just the actual words.
report.
Like
Okay.
an Ivy League school at a very low cost.
No, I'm with you.
Is the idea.
No problem.
Budget Ivy. Okay. Of course, the challenge is you have budget cuts and you want to maintain that hard-earned quality while at the same time making sure that college education is accessible. And we know how this will work. You could imagine that I could design an educational system with every bell and whistle and opportunity and do everything I can for students and make it so expensive that it wasn't accessible except to the rich. Or I could turn around and offer very little at a very low cost. I would be very accessible, but I wouldn't deliver much of an education. And so that's what I mean by this tension. And the tension is particularly strong right now, I think, because of the budget cuts. For FSU, down 25% in the core budget. We lost about 20% of our technical staff, decrease in our clerical staff. We suspended ourselves, 37 different programs and majors. We're down about 125 faculty, for which we're delivering the education to the same number of students. That's affected our ability to get grants and contracts and generate jobs. And we still have quite a few credit hours that are being taught on non-recurring funds. In my view, if I look over that entire landscape, 2 things are more pressing than anything else. One is that we're down 32% in assistant professors. One of the things you watch through a faculty member's career on average is that as they're moving towards promotion and they're trying to make a name for themselves in their discipline, these are their most productive years. And they're building up this productivity, and a lot of people kind of level off. They can't go any farther, and some of them begin to decline, and a rare few go forward at a higher rate. But if you're not having that young, highly energetic faculty group, then your overall productivity as the university begins to decline, and unfortunately I think your ranking ends up declining. On the other end of it, our salaries are now 17% below our research peer. And I was sort of brought up with about a 15% rule. If I can offer you 15% more than what you're making now, I can steal you. My chances go way up. So this notion of not having the young, highly productive faculty simultaneously with having people try to steal my productive faculty is a suggestion that Florida State will have a long-term problem in maintaining its quality. And just so you see this graphically, that green line is the number of assistant professors. The blue line at the top, full professors. And so this is sort of a somewhat hidden impact of the budget cuts, is that hiring freezes, loss of faculty to cover the budget cuts, some promotions, and some people leaving is taking all of that youth movement in the universities, that highly productive youth movement in the universities, and sending it completely in the wrong direction. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. The other thing is I want to make sure that you know we spend dollars wisely. Now, this comes from U.S. News, and that's self-reported financial data, and I'm not sure I would trust it, but this is their perspective from self-reporting of universities that they use then to produce rank. So in a perfect world, if I had everybody spend every dollar perfectly to deliver a high-quality education, every university would fall on that red line, where I have rank of the university, quality rank on the bottom, and total financial resources on the axis, the vertical axis. The farther away from that line you are, the more out of whack you are in how well you spend your dollars. So what I would point out is that FSU sits on the far edge where our ranking far exceeds our financial resources. The only dots that are up there are public universities. So there are a lot of privates that are ranked up there higher on that map. But the fact that FSU is so far off the line tells you that we're very efficient at spending every dollar we make it count. Okay. I did it again. All right, so that sort of gives you a suggestion of what some of those issues are. And again, you sort of bear with me that I'm not going off track here too far. Now, what are the choices that I have? Well, I can go to the state and ask for more money and reverse that disparity in faculty salaries and hire assistant professors. Doesn't seem to me that they have the money, and I'm sort of loath to go with my hand out. We can work on online education. It's a huge step forward, and I appreciate the board's efforts in market tuition very much. But so far, this is a limited source of revenue in this state compared to many other states. I can increase the out-of-state students. A lot of universities are doing that, and they're doing it because they pay 5 times as much, and this is a way that they can use those dollars to subsidize their programs. Of course, one of my problems would be the number of parents who would tell me that I just gave away the place of a Florida student, because it's very hard to get into Florida State now. I can increase in-state enrollments, but interestingly, without state funds to come with it, I currently cannot deliver the education that I'm delivering if I just have that student paying in-state tuition and not having a state dollar to go with it. So here's this number one complaint, that Florida State, financially accessible, difficult to get into, the accessibility is not enough slots to come from the parents who would like to come. I think last week we passed 33,000 applications for about 6,000 places in the university. And so, but I can't afford to increase my in-state students at current rates without changing how I deliver education. Philanthropy is another source that I can compensate for, and we're doing that as fast as we possibly can with some success, but it's not a light switch. And the last one there is a tuition increase. And of course, the thing we worry about most, and we should worry about most, is that by having that tuition increase, we're going to negatively impact accessibility. So, my view still is that the tuition is perhaps the best choice on that list and might also help me increase the number of students that have access to Florida State. And I say that because we rank 48th out of 50 states. We're going up quickly, but I sat down with Bud Peterson, the president of Georgia Tech, just a few weeks ago, and he looked at me and he said, what's your tuition going up? And I said, we're asking for 15%. And he said, well, I've got permission to go up 16% and 21%. I have 2 years in a row. And his tuition is much higher than mine already. So I know I'm losing to him in terms of what he can invest in his faculty and students and what I can. Okay, the other thing that's interesting is that we get a lot of grief for 15% increase, but a 15% increase at FSU is a 4% increase at Penn State. We're so low that everybody else looks like they're not increasing their tuition, but in fact their rates are always so high on a dollar per dollar value. That's quite a, so who gets the bad press? Of course, Florida gets the bad press for going up 15%, when Penn State should get equally bad press for going up 4%.
They'll appreciate that.
I'm sure my friends up there would appreciate that a lot. And of course...
That'll sport rioting in the streets at Penn State tonight. I hope you know that.
All right. And of course, we can go up 15% with your permission until we reach the national average. And it's interesting, the national average last year went up 8%, slightly over $600. And FSU up 15% is slightly under $700. So you see sort of where we are in terms of the national increase. Okay, so I start to worry about this a lot. And I sense that the Board of Governors is worried about this a lot. And so I stopped sitting there saying, you know, please give me more, and said to myself, we need to ask just exactly what do our students pay? Because this is the financial aid piece, and that's going to be a lot more informative than the sticker price. So, the actual data, what I went and did was ask my poor financial aid director to tell me exactly what every one of my 27,000 in-state undergraduates are paying. And even though Bright Futures have changed and tuition and fees have changed, I think you're going to see that there's still a lot of room here to negotiate. And I will say, since I submitted this report to you, I've recalculated it for the new Bright Futures rules, and I've recalculated it for changes in tuition level, if allowed, through 2014. Okay, so here is what my 27,000 students actually have paid. Every single student is on this chart. Everything to the left of the red line, the students are getting money back from the university. So what you see is that this last year, 39% of our students paid no tuition and fees and got a total between them of $42 million back for housing, food, and clothing. To the right of the red line are students that paid something for tuition and fees, and what you see is that the tall pole there, which is paying between $500 and $750 a year for tuition and fees, is a line, I don't know whether you can see it at the bottom of each bar, where 71% of our students have paid less than $750 a year in tuition and fees. So the university students paid a total of $31 million, and we sent checks back totaling almost $42 million to our student population. You'll also see that in our in-state population, that only 19 students paid more than $3,000 per year. Now, this is every single in-state student. Now, of course, it's very important not to just lump everybody together. And as I said, this excludes loans and excludes prepaid because somebody is paying for that. So this is only counting for Bright Futures, federal aid, university aid, and other sources of scholarships that we know about. So now, the other issue here is, what about the need-based student? So if we look at Pell students as a definition of need-based students, we took our 6,000 plus Pell students out of that previous diagram, and you see that everybody on the right, everybody on the left, that red line, received money back. So $34 million was contributed to those 6,000 plus Pell students to cover housing, food, and books and other expenses. And on the right side are all those students that actually paid something towards tuition and fees. And you will see that that total for the 6,000 plus students is $664,000. So this year, because of differential tuition, Florida State University declared that all need-based students, as defined by Pell status, as long as they fill out the paperwork in a timely fashion, all tuition and fees for those students across the university, if they're in-state, will be paid. And so we basically issued this as a guarantee to our in-state students that are Pell-based. All of their tuition and fees will be covered. And now, to me, this is an extraordinary story and one that this state really needs to be complimented on, because what it's telling you is that we have made the university quite accessible. And now the challenge is actually turning away people who would like to come and can come. So it's the number of slots we have, and the other challenge is not that financial accessibility, but quality factors. Now, I will say that we have repeated this exercise with the new Bright Futures rules and the changes in tuition. And so what you see is by 2014, $6 more million go into our Pell recipient scholarships, and the increased cost of tuition is slightly more than $2 million. So with differential tuition, if half of our 15% is differential tuition, there's more money going into the pockets of our students to cover housing and food and books than there is today. Okay, so in my mind, this is something really to be proud of. Tuition and fees, at least, are not a barrier to our students. There are other barriers to our students. And we're an extraordinarily accessible university in a state which I think is extraordinarily accessibility. It really is founded on the availability of a diverse number of financial aid opportunities, the federal ones, the state ones, and the private ones. And the interesting thing about it is I think the stronger that we make our universities, the more financial aid we can expect, because we watch that affects the number of Bright Future students and their quality. It certainly enhances philanthropy to have a good university and a great university argue for student scholarships and raising those funds. And it's also interesting that those good students attract private scholarship funding as well. I always worry that this notion of runaway costs is something that I think is a bigger problem for the nation than it has been for Florida so far, given where we sit. And you know, I every time I see a legislator, I do my best to tell them that I think that they've done a fantastic job in making higher education accessible here with a great financial aid picture. And I hope that they will let us fight through the tough budget times so that we do not sacrifice quality. Because I really believe that we have prevented the best and brightest, many of them, from stepping out of this state and going elsewhere. But I think if we do decline on quality, if we don't have this balancing act quite right, then parents will pay the freight to make sure that they've done right by their students. Thank you for your attention. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, it was, Dr. Barron. Let me ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah.
First of all, obviously that 15% cap is not a cap that this board put in place. It's a cap that the legislature put in place. So I don't think we have the authority to move above that.
Yes, and that's okay.
And secondly, I'd like to ask you, what can we do for FSU to help you move toward that quality picture, the quality goals that you have? What can this board do to help you do that?
Yeah, I sense in many, many different conversations that the board is quite eager and interested in doing that. You know, I think there are lots of things, and some of them may be politically quite difficult. If I knew what my tuition increases were going to be for more than 1 year, I start to make some bets and start to invest in areas that I think would produce good jobs. And because it's fascinating when you live in a world where you're always wondering when the other shoe is going to drop and then what's going to happen. And so you don't plan until the end. And so I think things like that start to make a difference. If you have a sense of commitment that we know that we've lost some ground, and we know that many of our competitors out there are still charging forward faster than we are. I think looking especially in this day with the attitude of the legislature and the governor's office, to look at ways in which we might be able to reduce some of the burden. It has nothing to do with this Board of Governors, but I marveled at the fact that to maintain a federal grant in our universities costs less than to maintain a state grant. And the feds already have a substantial amount of bureaucracy. And if everybody has kind of a different set of rules compared to a similar set of rules, and so you start to be able to look at many of the things like that and see the opportunities for saving some money and beginning to move forward. I think a focus on retention rates would have a dramatic impact on the cost of education to this state. Whatever we can do and sharing the ideas of how to improve retention rates makes an enormous amount of difference, because if you have somebody go in their freshman year and somebody's paying for it and then they drop out, you've just lost that money. And so I think there are a lot of issues like that you could come up with, and I sort of deliberately took 3 very different topics there, but I think you could come up with a list that would be perhaps energizing to look at and work at, and some won't pan out.
Questions of the doctor?
Yeah. You brought up some of these changes, and I'm interested in where you, if you were king, where you would, what kind of tuition increases you'd like to have, and that you think you could support and that your students could afford given the amount of financial aid. Because I think this is very interesting, and I think it suggests that not that you're entitled to your 15% request, but I'm getting from the feeling from what I hear and what I hear in Tallahassee that you think that's really not enough in order for you to get your university to where you want to go. So
okay.
What would be enough?
Okay, so to tell you the truth, if I knew the 15% was going to come until I had the national average, I would probably be a very happy person, and I would start to plan on it. And so I do not want to push the limit. Occasionally, I think that it would be nice to take one big lump and be tar and feathered and know that the following years we weren't going to put 15% out there and 15% out there, because each time it sounds bad and each time people are stressed about it. And we haven't recovered from the $85 million loss. We're still operating at a deficit, and we're just got our fingers crossed that we won't lose more. I mean, I would like to be able to compensate if there is another cut to be able to compensate on the tuition increase side. 15% each year for me until 2014 means that 80% of my students will be paying less than $2,000 in tuition and fees. To me, that's still a good bargain compared to the rest of the country.
Okay, so just so because I want to get to how you're going to spend the money once and to move the university too. But just so I understand it, if we could come up with a system to give you some predictability about the 15%, you're not seeking more than that. Because I might be in favor for more. I mean, but I'm just asking you.
If I could get to the national average in 3 years, I'm in a lot better place in being able to compensate for these issues. I don't want to make the university less accessible. I do want to make sure my faculty are paid in a competitive way, and then I'm not losing those assistant professors. That 15% will generate for me, I think it's about $45 million. I lost 85, but some of those things we're compensating for. To get back in those 3 years would make an enormous amount of difference, especially if I could plan for it. I would change my mind if I lose a lot of money in this session.
I understand. And listen, you're going to change it. I mean, people change, the presidents change their minds all the time. And excuse me, Mr.
No, please.
The discussion about the regulations we impose upon you, a lot of that is imposed by the legislature and
not by you.
And not by us.
Yes.
And we're given the duty to see that you give us the information, and we're the bad people because we're charged with enforcing it. I don't know that the board would necessarily have a big problem with trying to figure out a way to streamline that with the university, because I recognize that could be. There's a lot of gossip in Tallahassee now that Florida State would like to get out from under the Board of Governors. Where are you on that? And to get out from under the 15% and go its own way, maybe with the University of Florida?
Okay, so first of all, can I tell you how much I appreciate the fact that you asked me that question directly and even in public?
Depends on the answer.
Well, you'll get to know me better.
It's okay. From my viewpoint, having the ability to try to invest some dollars in a more flexible fashion would be a really good thing, because I think we have more avenues for how we might compete. I do not think that requires us to get out from under. But if I can be just equally as frank with you,
please.
Every time I look at our tuition and worry about whether or not that 15% might be achieved, I get really nervous, because I can't lose any more assistant professors. And my personal feeling is you go 3 years without very many raises, or without raises, you will lose the cream of your crop. I lost a few faculty members, and they took $25 million a year in external support. That's $25 million of income for this state in terms of jobs. I have to be able to compete for those people. If you move down to a point where all you do is hunker down and sit there and decide how to protect yourself, which I think all of us do when we lose that kind of money, I don't see how you can be a jobs engine. I don't see how you can sit there and say, my university ought to invest here because this is a great opportunity for entrepreneurship. And yes, South Florida should really go for it over in this area because that matches what their skill set is. I think if you're in that hunkered down mode, then nobody takes that step.
Okay, one last thing, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic with your position. I very feel strongly we should try to accomplish all this within a system. But I'm sympathetic. What I haven't seen from Florida State, and you and I have talked about this, is a plan that says if you give me another 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 million dollars a year, I'm going to move Florida State from 47th among the publics to 25th.
Yeah.
And it would be a lot easier for me to be a cheerleader for that when I get to see the plan, and I just haven't seen the plan. And that's not necessarily fair for you. You're new, and everybody's struggling just to keep their head above water. But I do think that it would be helpful to have something that says, you know, we want to do this, but here's what you're going to get in return. And that's what I would like to see.
Yeah, so I will tell you that I've already started crisscrossing the state with 10 big ideas on how FSU can move forward and have a dramatic impact on this state. And so I'm glad to share them. In fact, one conversation that you and I had was, you said, well, show me what you would do with it. And so I think we can show you a lot of great ideas. That's not something that when you're in a budget-constrained environment that we sit around this table and talk about what big things we want to do next. But FSU, we've had several retreats with the deans, with many external donors, and now across the state with a set of big ideas on how we should move forward, and I'd be happy to share them anytime.
And I would hope you would work with the Board of Governors to work with you to do this all within the system.
But I will tell you, I do talk to legislators, and I do talk to a lot of our alumni, and it could be that, I'm impressed by the number of rumors that crisscross Tallahassee and other parts of this state. But my objective has really been only one, to make sure that I can justify that FSU deserves those increases and that we will spend the money wisely. That's really my sole objective.
Okay. Mr. B, can I ask a question? Yes, sir.
Dr. Barron, have you had a chance to look at if the Bright Future was based on need-based or semi-need-based? At some point that, look, if you have a pretty good sized income, you know, my kids, when they go to school in Florida, perhaps, you know, they can afford to pay. And have you looked at that? If there was a change in that, how much change it would make on your revenue? And
Well, obviously, I have about 6,500 Pell students right now and 27,000 in-state students. So you could start to imagine if the students that could pay were paying more, what it is that they would generate.
so you would say there is a 20,000 student less, 27,000 less 6,500, so about 20,000. And let's say that you increase that need even more than what the Pell is, another 10,000. Another half. So if 10,000 people, 10,000 students paid, how much that would bring to the bottom line?
Yeah, well, I don't know whether I can do the math that fast, but I can tell you 15% until 2014. I actually have the number here, generates, after we remove the Pell Student Aid and look at waivers, generates about $42 million for the university.
So what you're saying is that if we let the 15% stays on till 2014 with the same bright future, meaning...
This is with the new Bright Futures.
With the new bright future,
Yep.
Meaning that if you have 3.5 and if you make 1270 in SAT, you still get 100%, you will be fine.
I would recover 42 million of the 85 I lost. And
Per year?
Per year.
So it's a 42
So
million?
85 million is a recurring loss,
Uh-huh.
and I would have a recurring gain of 42 million while putting 6 million into my need-based aid. And that need-based aid, the cost for tuition and fees for those students would go up 2 million, but I put in 6.
So that means that would that take you to the middle of the, where would you be as far as, we are like number 48 now.
So it all depends on what the other universities out there do. But if the other universities increase their tuition on the average of 6 or 7% a year, then I believe I cross over to the average in 2015.
In 2015. So you'd be in the middle. Now, you're saying that $42 million a year, would you believe that, would you agree that if you were managed to get that money?
Yeah.
Or can we try to sell this? And I think Dean was trying to come up with something. It is important for us to be able to sell to legislators that if we do continue doing the 15%, we do a huge favor to our state, both in the form of job, creation of job, bring new ideas, fueling the engine of economic development I mean, can we do that? I mean, can you help us sell that basically? I mean, have you...
Quite frankly, I think I would be delighted to do that, and I would bet a lot of other presidents would as well.
Governor Edwards.
Excellent job of showing us that 15% in terms of real dollars is not the 15% I think a lot of people thought it was when that cap was in place. You also, being in Tallahassee and traveling a lot in your first year, I'm sure you've met with a number of the legislatures. What would you believe the possibility would be with the full support of us as a system in getting the 15% cap removed with authority at the Board of Governors level to impose whatever the board considered to be a reasonable tuition increase? And I think implicit in that is the concept that it would not necessarily, now last year everybody got 15. There's going to come a time in the near future when I don't think everybody's going to be entitled to 15. But some should be or could be entitled to 25. What is the possibility, in your opinion, of removing the 15% camp, and would you feel that yourself and the other university presidents would strongly support that?
Okay, I never want to speak for the other university presidents because I think everybody has a different set of problems and issues that occur. I think every time I talk with parents of FSU students, they tell me, oh yeah, it's a bargain. I paid $300 last, and they're sort of like, this makes them feel really good. And they'll say, I'll buy you a car if you don't go to Wake Forest and instead go to FSU. And so there is this sort of, I think, an understanding among many of the parents at FSU that this is a pretty good deal. I think the biggest complaint, as I said, is they can't get in. It's too hard to get in. Why can't you be more accessible? Well, it's not accessible on money, it's accessible on the fact that the standards are going up, and up. Now, when I talk to anybody who is in the political limelight, you're going to feel a lot of heat about that 15%. And I would wish openly that someone would say FSU is going to increase their tuition $50 a month as opposed to 15%. It's a big difference in the way it sounds. This is not reality, incidentally. 15% is a better headline, but it's $50 a month. So, I think when you speak that way, and the more people who hear and understand what the costs are and where we're sitting in trying to deliver a good curriculum, they're okay with it. When they sit there and look politically at the pressure of saying, we're going to give FSU 15% 2 years in a row so they can do a better job of planning, I think people step back and say, wow, that's painful. So this is why I talk about it, is to make sure people know really what a student pays. It isn't for me to sit there and blow the doors off all the rules and everything like that. I'm just trying to make sure that no one in the midst of watching that number of assistant professors decline, all those energetic people decline, I just don't want that to continue. So I want people to hear what the story is. That's
Governor.
Just one
and it's going to be a hard sell.
If as a part of that, say you got 20% for 3 years.
Yeah.
Would you be able, following Governor Colson's concept of showing what you're going to do with that money, would you be able to increase the size of your student body that would provide more spaces for accessibility with that money?
I believe that FSU, with those types of increases, I'm not sure I'd want to stomach the political pressure myself of doing that 3 years in a row, but I do believe that if we're at that level, that Florida State will ask if we can't open the door to more students, because we'll be able to deliver the education that we have been delivering at that type of
I just made
level.
up those 20% 3 years in a row.
But, I should also point out that I actually am somewhat used to the notion of saying what it is that I plan to spend spend the money on. And in the Texas system, when we asked for a tuition increase, we showed what were we going to do with it.
Right. Well,
And so I would sit there and say, I would like the geosciences, they had differential tuition that was rather different because it cost more to deliver a chemistry class than an English class, you charged more.
yeah.
And if I wanted to increase the cost for my college, I had to say, this is what I'm going to spend the money on and why, and in order to get the tuition increase that I want. Now, that could be a burden for us, but I'm used to the notion of, and to say, this is what I want to do. This is what I think I can do for this state.
Right. Unfortunately, we're kind of running out of time a little bit, so I'd like to continue to move this conversation, Governor Rood, and then.
Okay, I'll be brief. I have struggled with the tuition increase. Last year was painful, and I guess one of the things that I struggle with is where are the people that we are impacting? They're not here to defend themselves, the students and the families. And so the material that you've provided before and this presentation has really helped me understand how we impact them. And I have to admit, very surprising. I also want to point out that in our conversations during this workshop, the importance of excellence can't be diminished. But when we put financial handcuffs on you, we can't pursue the excellence that all of us want this system to achieve. And I think that's the thing that we have to realize, that if we are going to get this type of excellence, we've got to be better partners with all of the universities. But one question I would like to ask, we always talk about, or the law states, we have the ability to increase until we hit the national average, which means just the average. Should we, if we are going to be taking some bold steps and go back to the legislature and see if we can get more flexibility, maybe long-term commitments, should we revisit what average means, or should it be a peer average? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I really do think it depends on what your objectives are and how you see the university system evolving. And I use an example of one of my prior institutions where they made very deliberate efforts early on to raise their tuition and then to reinvest it. And they were deliberately doing in these areas where they thought it would impact their research budgets and would increase their partnerships with corporations. And they had quite a large number of applicants and were watching very carefully how each tuition increase would impact the number of people applying. And the fascinating thing was, and I don't want to go there, they're now one of the most expensive publics in the country, that they didn't lose out on the number of people that were applying. They had more people applying because there was this sense that they were still a bargain as a public compared to many privates, but they were getting competitive. So this last year, they were named as the most corporate-friendly university in the country by the Wall Street Journal. And they rank at the very top in the amount of corporate dollars that are coming into the university and partnered with the university. It was a deliberate strategy to take those dollars and invest it in areas where they felt that their students could get jobs and go out there and be successful. So they became a one-stop recruiting area. So part of this is what is the objective. And my view is that for a very long time, the objective of this state was make it accessible, keep students in Florida. Again, thank you. I think it had a tremendous amount of impact. But now, as budget gets tight, I think you have to ask the question, okay, where is my investment strategy to drive Florida in the direction that you really want to drive Florida in, and can you generate those dollars? So that, they had the luxury of smaller increases over a longer period of time, but slightly above the national average. We're playing catch-up.
Right.
And so I do think by the time you get to the national average, you should be having a discussion about what would have real impact if we were able to develop this new field or that new field in a way that would really impact the state.
Governor Duncan.
Yes, you mentioned the additional burden that the research grants from the state were presenting to
As an
you
example.
by comparison.
Yeah.
I guess, would you or Dr. Kemper be willing to maybe come to one of our next Student Affairs Committee meetings, since we can oversee some of the research stuff, and walk us through that? I'd really like to understand how much of that's statutorily imposed versus maybe something we're doing, just so we can at least understand that.
I believe that it is not something that you're doing at all. I think this is just the way many different state agencies operate. And if collectively we were arguing for mechanisms by which the same type of monitoring was required, and even the same as the federal government, if that was sufficient, you'd probably save all the universities that are generating research grants some real dollars.
I would love to understand that better.
We got two more questions coming, and then
Dr. Barron, first of all,
the Chancellor.
As always, it's an outstanding presentation, and it's incredibly thorough. I almost hate to ask the question, you think a good approach would be for every university to go through every portfolio of every in-state undergraduate student and do exactly the same thing? And remember, John Hitt's not here with his 50-some-odd thousand, so it's okay to answer the question openly and honestly.
So again, I would hesitate to ask anything of my fellow presidents, and I will tell you that I first asked this because I was paying very close attention to Norm Tripp, and he was talking about whether this was a burden on any families, and I took him very seriously on that particular issue, and I leaned over to people from FSU and I said, can we get exactly how much our students pay? And they said yes. And I said, can we do it by tomorrow? And I think they just about had heart failure. And it took an enormous amount of effort to go and do every single student. From my viewpoint is, again, I'm trying to make sure that we can actually get those increases so that we can recover effectively. That's my objective.
And I was only half teasing. I wouldn't
so
put
maybe
you on
the
hook
point's
for
been
that.
made, though.
But my general point is that what you did is incredibly helpful, I think, to both your Board of Trustees, because they're in the mix, but then obviously the Board of Governors, who ultimately has to make the bottom line decision on differential tuition and fees. And to make it without that information is a swag. It's a guess.
It is.
I'm not sure if there's a way to do it that doesn't require going through every single jacket, but I have to tell you, it is, at least to me, it's an incredibly helpful way to look at, in this case, only Florida State University,
yes,
only your population of in-state undergraduate students, but in that regard, incredibly helpful. I wanted to do two more things, then I promise I'll quit. First of all, did I understand you correctly, and this is a general question too, because I had penciled in before Governor Colson asked his good question, I penciled in the three. Is it the amount, is it the predictability, or is it both on the issue of tuition?
It's both.
But if the predictability were there, I think I heard you say the amount becomes less pressing than having to deal with the incremental wonder of whether you're going to get 15 or less or...
Not everybody, I mean, because the state budget is still volatile, but I do think we're going to recover. But from my particular viewpoint, I believe FSU has been very conservative about what to do with our $85 million loss. We took a lot of it at the front end, not believing that it actually was going to get better. And you start to become very loath to make an investment in a program where I see some areas that could have tremendous amount of impact, and it's a $3 million investment. Do I do it? Do I not do it? If I start to have a sense where I'm more secure about my future is going to be, then some of those we're going to make the bet now. Still not getting carried away.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But I think it all comes under a larger umbrella of how the whole system approaches this issue. It would be different for Florida or FSU than it would be for FAU or FIU or Florida A&M based on population of students and each individual one of those portfolios. in critical mass, it creates a different picture for each institution and their ability to do what differential tuition was meant to do a long time ago when it was first created, and that was create a market approach individualized to each institution. And a big part of that is students' ability to pay.
Yep.
Last question on this issue of access. This is just to you, but it's one that we're trying to get our arms around more and more. When you did your work plan, I can't remember, you are how many students right now at FSU, President?
Is this
undergrad?
All students of all flavors between 40 and 41.
And how big would Florida State consider growing? I'm not trying to put you on the spot or nail you down. I'm just trying to get a general sense in your work plan.
To tell you the truth, we have just begun the discussion that if our tuition rate was higher, and therefore we could really provide the education that we want to provide, would we increase that number? And we decided it becomes in the realm of possibility where now we don't even think about it. Our Board of Trustees and the administration have agreed that it shouldn't change. It should stay within 1% of what we are now.
And that is fair enough. It really is. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but it gets to this, for our board, this is the access issue. You're never going to satisfy all of the parents whose children don't get into these schools, not because they don't even have the credentials, but because we're running out of room.
Yeah.
Unless every school is going to go to 80,000 students, we're going to run out of capacity. So I'm real sensitive to that issue of parents saying, my son couldn't get into the University of Florida and he's got a 4.2 weighted GPA and a 1,400 SAT. Why can't he get in? Because the University of Florida is making some important strategic decisions about how big they want to become. And those have a bearing on quality, the way they see it organized. And it isn't that you're turning people away because you don't want them, but the question is, how big can you be? When you consider we're already limited in the out-of-state enrollment, that we have the 2+2 obligation to meet, you put all of that math together and a growing number of FTICs across the board, access, that question and concern is going to get to be a bigger and bigger issue. But thank you again for your presentation. Outstanding presentation.
We've got two more questions.
Yeah.
Governor Franklin.
I was just interested in wondering, how does your loan profile look in reference to how much debt, I guess, the average Florida State student might be walking across the stage with? And I guess according to your presentation, it seems like it wouldn't be that much in reference to how much aid they're getting back. But I was just interested because in reference to tuition increases, a lot of analysis and studies done and articles written about how much students are going into debt nowadays and taking almost 40 and 50 years to pay off. So I was wondering how your loan profile
so
looks.
I don't remember what the exact average is. My perception is that the availability of low-cost loans has some students borrowing money that actually isn't required for tuition and fees and their housing, but that they're actually impacting their quality of life. Now, that's not true for everybody. But it's probably a harder number to look at when you see what our aid packages are going to tuition and fees. I don't remember the number exactly. It's not a small number. It's below the national average, but it's not a small number, despite the fact that they have a lot of coverage.
Chairman Parker.
Thank you, Dr. Barron, and I certainly appreciate the thoughtful approach that you have with this issue. Because one question that I have is that quality is certainly a big concern of ours. And even with some of the decisions that we made last year, we did receive a great deal of pushback from the legislature saying, here, we give you an opportunity, you guys take it all the way. We anticipate that you guys would be a little more thoughtful and less giving. It was almost the response that we received. And in the economic times that we are now experiencing, and with the fact that so much of the mantra that we hear is cut back, no new taxes, I'm really interested in the kind of response that you've received from the legislative individuals that you've met with about this issue, because they're ultimately the ones who often come back to us and say, you've gone too far, and that's not the message that we're sending to our citizens right now.
Okay, so many times when I'm speaking and I show this information, first of all, it's a little bit eye-opening because it's not exactly what they expected. I'm complimenting them on what they've done for accessibility, and their expectation is, I'm going to ask for something, and my viewpoint is, you let us compete on a national stage a little bit more effectively, and I think we can solve our own problems. And my sense is that many of them actually really appreciate that viewpoint, and they realize that for the quality of education to be a top 50 university, that that a lot of students have the wherewithal to be able to chip in a little bit more in order to pull that off and appreciate quality. So I think there's that understanding, but there's always behind the door the notion of who will take the heat, because 15% sounds so large. But in our case, it's $50 a month.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been, Dr. Barron, thanks for coming before us. It's been an eye-opening discussion. Many of these things we're trying to deal with, and you've helped clarify it a little bit with us. And don't get it wrong, every institution in the system is facing the same kind of issues you are.
Yeah.
And there's no difference.
I appreciate all the questions greatly.
Okay. Thank you. Mrs. Anita Agnew, please. Come ahead.
Okay, great. Well, President Barron, that was a tough act to follow, and I'm afraid we're going to get back down in the weeds now for a few minutes. What Dan Kohnvogel asked us to do is actually talk a little bit about how financial aid decisions are made on the campus. We talked in a global sense of how aid works, but now we're going to talk about, at the campus level, how do schools make a decision on the type of aid that they give to students. All schools in the nation essentially work off of these underlying premises in making a financial aid award to a need-based student. One is that eligibility is based on family ability to pay and not on willingness to pay. So we're evaluating the family's income, assets, expenses, household size, and all of those types of things, and coming up with a family ability to pay, but not based on what the family says they're willing to pay. This is a decision is in terms of a ranking where we can put people in the overall categorization. We do also expect students to contribute to their education to the extent that they're able. This may come through student savings that a student brings with them to campus. It could come through part-time jobs while they're in school. It could come through student employment over the summers. We do have a lot of students who go to school year-round and don't have a student contribution, and other students who are helping their families meet normal living expenses. But to the extent that they're able, we do expect the student to contribute. And thirdly, we're looking at the family in their current circumstances. We're not making value judgments about what they should have done to this point in time and how much they should have saved. We're just taking a look, snapshot in time, as to the family's economic circumstances. When we talk about packaging, what we're talking about is taking the available aid that we've got from the various sources and putting together a financial aid award for a student. And there are many, many ways that a school could do this, and what I've done is just listed 4 common types of things that you might see in terms of packaging methodologies. The first, where you would put grant first or self-help first, would mean that you'd make an award, and you as a campus would make a decision that the first aid that you would give to the student would be some type of aid, loan, or work, and then you'd build up in a ladder until you've met financial need. Equity packaging is an attempt to give everybody the same running start. So, and this is probably what you would see most common in most campuses. We might say that the first 60% of a cost of education should be met through what the family can contribute and grants and scholarships. And so 35% or 40%, in this case 40%, would be met through student self-help. And so equity packaging, what you'd see most commonly. Special groups would be packaging for students that you have specific criteria for. For instance, your priorities might be to students in the sciences or to first-generation students or to some other category of student. And so those students in that category might receive a different package than you might give to other people. And leveraging is a term that you hear primarily used in private universities, but it's essentially preferential packaging based on the likelihood of your ability to track that individual to your campus. So a student who's highly recruited, who has many other aid offers from many other schools, might be offered a better package because your likelihood of recruiting that individual is a little more difficult. It's a little cynical kind of way of going about it, but it does produce the best use of institutional dollars in terms of producing yield. But you don't see that used very commonly in public institutions. That's used primarily for institutional aid at private institutions. When we sit and put together a financial aid package, there are a number of things that schools consider as they make their decision. One is, of course, the institutional mission. You want to be sure that the financial aid packages that you're putting together are helping the university to achieve its goals and not working counter toward them. For instance, if my university decided that it was going to go out and recruit out-of-state students, I would have to be sure to have a discussion with the university about the type of aid package we would be offering to out-of-state students, because as it stands right now, it would be very difficult for us to meet their need. We'd also want to look at the student demographic. Every institution has a very different type of student body. Ours, of course, is very traditional at the University of Florida. Some of our urban campuses, and we'll show examples of this in a little bit, have students that are older than average or perhaps working in the community, married with families. And so their demographic and their needs are going to be very, very different from an 18-year-old residential student living on campus. Probably the most important thing is how much money do we have and what types of aid are available. We'd all like to have a lot more grant aid, but you have to deal with the sources of aid that you have to deal with. And one thing we might hear from students or families is, well, how come Georgia Tech could give me so much more grant than the University of Florida? Well, they might have a lot more money to spend, or they have fewer students to spend their money on. And so that really drives a lot of our decisions. Some of the other things that we look at, though, are what's an acceptable self-help level? How much work and loan is reasonable for a student to continue to be successful at your institution? It wouldn't do us any good to offer packages of $5,000 in federal work study if the student can't realistically earn that amount of money, or the expectation is that they'd be working so many hours that that would affect their academics. So we do look at what's a reasonable level of work and loan in a package that a student can still continue to be academically successful. We also look overall at an acceptable level of debt. How much debt can students carry? And one of the questions a little earlier related to the average student loan debt at FSU. The national average is somewhere between $16,000 and $17,000 for four-year public universities. What's acceptable for one student may not be acceptable for another student. A student going into a medical field, for instance, is going to be able to carry a much higher debt load than a student who chooses to go into education or social work or some field that's not particularly high paying. At the University of Florida, our debt level is $16,000 for a four-year degree. So considering when they go out and buy their first car at $25,000 and pay that off in 5 years, a debt of education for $16,000 that you pay off in 10 years is a pretty good value on the dollar. And then again, differential packaging, which I mentioned earlier, the idea of dealing with certain populations of your students that you want to give a preferential package to, for instance, first-generation students. What we wanted to do very, very briefly is just give some examples of how those packaging models that we talked about have very different results. The next couple of examples I'm going to show are not any institution, they're just examples to show a point. But in this, if we had a policy at an institution that said gift aid was awarded first, and the first $10,000 of need came from grants and scholarships, this might be what you would see for those students. Student A, this happens to be an out-of-state student, for example. They're actually from a fairly high family contribution, $12,000, but because it's an out-of-state student, they still have a lot of need. And so if you had a pure gift aid first policy of $10,000, the student would get a $10,000 grant to attend your institution. Student B doesn't need $10,000. They only need $8,100. So their gift aid would be 100%, but it would be only the amount of their financial need. And student C would get $10,000 of their $15,000 need met with grants and scholarships, and the balance would be through loan and work. Using those same students and using the equity packaging model that I talked about earlier, this is a case where we said that we're going to meet 60% of the cost of attendance through family contribution, grants, and scholarships. So in this first example, most of the students, 60%, which came to, I think, $14,000 and some odd change, is met through family contribution. So in this case, they would get $2,250 in grants and then work and loan for the balance. Student B would, in this case, they actually need $2,850 to get to their 60%. They have a Bright Future scholarship, so that pretty much meets their gift aid percentage, and they wouldn't get an additional scholarship or grant. And then the third student that we mentioned earlier gets their full 65% met through grants and scholarships and the balance through work. The purpose of these is just to show how packaging policies can be very, very different in the type of aid and the amount of aid that a student may receive.
Karen, is there any reason why a student can't get enough aid to go to the universities?
If they don't apply, if they don't apply for aid on time, if they're late in getting documents and tax returns into us, if they turn down certain types of aid, then they might not get enough aid. We have a number of students who say, I'm not willing to work, or I'm not willing to take a loan, and so they have what appears to be unmet need, but it's what we would consider a voluntary decision on their part. But we do have students who are getting too much loan because we don't have enough grant.
Can we kind of move a little quicker?
Yeah, okay.
I've taken all these other committees' time, and
quite all right.
I'm getting embarrassed about it.
What we wanted to do now is actually, Anissa and I, just to give you a couple of real-world examples of a financial aid package on our campus. And the first one is for a low-income student. And this is a person with 3 in the household, 1 in college. And this is the type of aid package they would actually get at the University of Florida if they applied on time. We do use a 65% gift aid percentage, 35% loans and self-help. And so we would go first in and put in a Pell Grant, then their Florida Medallion, a Bright Future Scholarship, and then fill the remaining gap with institutional or federal grants, and then loan and work for the balance.
This is a similar student at University of North Florida, and what you'd see is the student with the Bright Futures would have a lower federal and institutional grant. The student without Bright Futures, we make up for that in with federal institutional grants. We have a 60-40 model, equity packaging model.
We also worked up the same type of analysis for a middle-income student, and by this we're defining it as somebody in about a $90,000 income range for in the household 2 in college. And again, the same type of situation. This student would not be eligible for any federal grants or state grants like the Florida Student Assistance Grant, and so any gift aid that they would be eligible for on our campus would be coming through institutional funding.
This one is particularly interesting at the University of North Florida because the student with the Bright Future Scholarship and a contribution of $9,000 shows that they actually have a decreased loan amount because all of the 60% is met and then it goes into some of the 40, so it decreases the loan amount. But the net result of that scholarship is that it also leaves $1,802 on the table that would be an institutional grant for some other need-based student to receive.
Sure. It seems to me asking a family of 4 with 2 in college to contribute $9,000 is a lot of money, and that just seems, and this is the group that I'm most worried about. It seems to, because it is the least amount of, they're not federal loan money available to them, and this is where it seems to me we're really impacting people when we raise tuition.
Yeah, this is actually a fairly wealthy family in terms of financial aid eligibility. They do have substantial assets, which many of our families do not have. But the philosophy when the Department of Education established the family contribution formula, the federal methodology that Dan talked about earlier, is that the family can choose to meet this contribution in any way they see fit. They might choose to do that through having bought a prepaid tuition plan. They may do that actually out of their current dollars, which I agree with you would be a bit of a stretch. Or they could opt to pay it down over the long term through what they call a parent loan. The expectation would be that the parent would be borrowing some or all of their contribution to help the student to go to school. So how the family would choose to manage that contribution would be up to them. What you have to keep in mind is the needs analysis formula is not true family ability to pay. For any individual student, it could be too high or too low. It's really a rationing model in terms of putting people on a scale from the neediest to the less needy. And when there's not enough money to go around, then it gets cut off somewhere along that time. But we could argue for hours on what a reasonable family contribution is. It's how many angels dance on the head of a pin.
No, but I don't know that. I think this is such a high contribution for a family of 4 with 2 people in college. You're saying $18,000 a year after-tax dollars out of 90 is going. Plus, they're going to take on loans of another couple $1,000s a year. Plus, they're going to. So I would hope that as we increase our amount of need-based aid by the 30% contribution, that we're able to do a better job of meeting the needs of this family.
It's a concern. There's no question about it. And having had a student that just went to college, I can tell you I thought my contribution was excessively high. But again, it's a balance. When you look at what the family contributes, that not only is writing a check to the university for $9,000, in fact, it's almost never writing a check to the university. That includes the computer they bought for the student for Christmas that they take to school when they come, the books, the clothing they bought for the student before the student came to school, sending those little care packages throughout the years. You have to keep in mind it's not necessarily cash out of pocket. The net amount is the same, but it's not just necessarily writing a check for that amount.
Chairman Parker.
I guess the concern that I have about the issue that Governor Colson just mentioned is that he said this is a the group that he's most concerned about, because they're the ones that don't fit into the Pell Grant category. However, they're paying this amount of money. Is the parent loan really the only option that we have for that family?
If you didn't buy a prepaid plan, pretty much, yeah. I mean, some families may choose to get a home equity loan on their own because it's tax deductible and there's a financial advantage to doing it through home equity. But in terms of us being able to make up that contribution with aid, it would pretty much be through a parent loan. I mean, we will also talk to the family if they say, I can't possibly come up with this contribution because I also have an elderly mother who's in nursing home care, or, you know, I was just downsized. You know, we'll take a look at all of those individual circumstances and make a judgment based on that. But if they don't have any unusual circumstances, then we are to some degree constrained. There is no doubt in financial aid that there is a cliff. A student who is Pell eligible qualifies for Pell Grant, for Florida Student Assistance Grant, for ACG and SMART grants from the federal government, and from the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. They qualify for all of those things. If you fall off the Pell scale, you don't qualify for any of those, and it's all institutional dollars to make up grant need for students who aren't Pell eligible.
One of the issues that we've grappled with as a board is that when we talk about need-based aid, the automatic question for those who work within the system is that is synonymous with Pell Grant. For folks like ourselves who are volunteers and part of a policy board, that does not necessarily mean that. You know, do we have the flexibility to determine what need-based is in our position, or is it just automatic that it's assumption that when we say need-based, that means Pell Grant?
No, need-based is any student whose family resources are less than the cost of attendance.
You're the first person to give me that definition.
Pell Grant is a family contribution on maximum eligibility for Pell Grant is the family contribution about $5,000, $5,500. On an $18,000 cost of attendance, somebody with a $6,000 family contribution qualifies for none of the federal or state grants, but they still need $12,000 to go to school. That is a needy student on our campus.
They still have $9,000 a need, but they're not Pell eligible.
Right. So then what would it take if we as a board, we're interested in helping that family that falls through the cracks? Yeah. And, you know, if previously all the responses we have been given is, well, you know, we kind of make it synonymous to Pell Grant, what would it take for us to do in order to assist that group of families, you know, who are kind of being lost in the shuffle?
It's essentially more grant money. You know, it comes down to that. Most of the schools, and I can't speak for all of my colleagues, but for Anissa and I, we use an equity packaging model, which means that if you're getting a lot of federal and state grants, you don't need a lot of money from us. But if you don't get any of those, then that's where our institutional dollars are going to go. So we're trying to get everybody so that nobody's having to work or borrow for more than 35%. Turned it around, our work loan equity percentage would be 35%. So regardless of how you got to the 60%, if you're short in there, or 65%, that's where we're filling an institutional grant.
So then if we as a board have said that, and I guess as a state we've said that with that differential tuition, that a certain percentage of that is need-based aid, then we have the flexibility also to define what need-based aid is, right? Versus saying it's just Pell Grant eligible students.
I keep speaking, and I should let Anissa have something to say. The differential doesn't specify. It just says need-based aid, and need by definition, already by definition, is cost of attendance less family contribution. So those students are already eligible for the differential dollars and the financial aid fee dollars. And
I have one, Mr. Chairman. I think one of the things that, and I don't know, somehow lets me sleep when I vote on these increases, is that we're assuming $8,500 here of room and board. And I'm not sure as a society, that we're going to be able to afford to give everybody a residential college experience over the next 20 or 30 years for that they're going to be able to go away and enjoy 4 years in beautiful Gainesville or Tallahassee or Jacksonville. And many of them are going to have, many of them don't have that. Will have to go to their urban universities and save those $8,500 or make a choice. What's important is we make access available to them someplace so they can get a college degree. And if they choose to borrow some more money, now that gives me a little bit of comfort. But I still think we need to improve the situation for the $90,000 a year family.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, very briefly, we just have a couple more slides and then we'll get off the stage. We did an analysis similar to Dr. Barron's, but using a different methodology. And we looked at the amount of net tuition that our students pay based on family income ranges. So this would be net of grants and scholarships. And so essentially up to a family contribution of about $7,500, our students aren't paying any tuition at all. The grants and scholarships they're receiving are sufficient to pay the tuition costs. And then it goes up a little bit from there. But even in the 17.5, which is essentially no need on our campus, or those who didn't apply for aid, their tuition, their net tuition is $685 on average. So that's really what people are paying cash out of pocket.
Now keep in mind, every institution is different and our population is much different. We don't have as many Bright Future scholars, so we have the same first four columns of 0 with cash out of pocket for the students who have EFCs up to $7,500, and then from there we go up, but still that's $1,489 for the entire year for fall, spring, 2 semesters.
When we talk about net price, it's actually just not net of tuition, it's net of cost. And so we also did the same type of analysis for the net cost of attendance. And so that's including the living expenses we mentioned earlier. So our lowest income students, their net cost to go to the University of Florida last year was about $5,300, and that's the portion that's met through loans or part-time employment. That's really the money that they're contributing through self-help. At the high end of the scale, it's about $13,000, $13,500 that families are paying. And again, that's loans, work, but a large portion of that is expected family contribution.
And we have the same scenario here, and you'll notice that our numbers are about off just about at the $2,800 difference between a Bright Future scholar. And again, that $7,500 is covered usually with a combination of other federal aid. And our students get $4,000 work study, and on average, our loan indebtedness at the end of the 4 years is $15,000. So probably about $3,500 a year.
Okay. If there are no questions, that concludes our presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting, and I feel good that our students have a financial way to go to the university system, go to college in Florida. I'd like to call on Braulio Colin, who is interim director of Enlace, Florida. So if you could give us a...
I promise to be brief, Mr.
Right.
Chairman.
No, by the way, I was incorrect. I thought somebody was following us, and you've got some time.
Oh, okay. We are in Central Time if you're in Pensacola. Thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share just a brief presentation on what our communities are doing around the state of Florida to help families gain access to financial aid and really work alongside our institutions. Since 2007, Enlace, Florida, or Enlace, Florida, however you want to pronounce it, has worked to engage communities for higher education, promoting college preparation, access, and success. And We're based at the University of South Florida, and our work includes building partnerships with community-based organizations and institutions to figure out ways we can engage high-need communities to build platforms and make sure they're doing some things constructively alongside our institutions. And I'm excited about sharing what one of those programs are in College Go Sunday. We are in transition to become the Florida College Access Network. That puts us in line with our national partners in terms of what other states are doing to build these types of infrastructure in communities to empower families and students to make sure they're prepared and ready to go once they they graduate from our high schools. See if I can get this thing to work here. Down. One of the tools that we deliver to the communities we work with is College Go Sunday Florida. And this event is a statewide event that takes place annually, and it helps families and students complete the free application for federal student aid, which is one of the key steps in gaining access to the grants and scholarships that was mentioned today. This year, this event takes place in partnership with many of our SUS institutions, the financial aid offices at many of the institutions that you oversee. Also, it involves partnerships with community-based organizations like YMCAs, Boys and Girls Clubs. We even have libraries opening up their doors on Sunday afternoon to help families with this online application. And so on February 20th, we have 46 different locations where any family or student can show up and get expert assistance with completing the form online that day. And they should be able to leave that event ready to go and prepared to enter into college. Another tool that we are delivering to communities throughout Florida is called the Know How to Go Florida campaign. This is a grassroots effort that is designed to build the capacity of our community-based organizations to offer college campus tours, financial literacy workshops to parents, student workshops that make sure that our students understand the steps they need to take to be prepared to enter into one of our institutions. And it's important that we build the capacity of our nonprofit sector in Florida to work alongside the New Florida Initiative. And so that's what we're excited about, and that's what we're doing. So with that pretty much sums up my presentation. And Florida can, in Lasse, Florida, we stand ready to work with you in terms of engaging communities for your New Florida Initiative. And we're partly supported by the Lumina Foundation, which has adopted a similar goal in terms of increasing the percentage of Americans with a post-secondary degree. So we're excited about our efforts. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Raleigh. Appreciate it very much. Well, we've moved through that pretty quick, and I've got a few comments that I'd like to make. And Madam Chairman, if you've got anything you'd like to say, I'd invite it. But first of all, personally, I think we've been talking about strategic planning, and in any kind of strategic planning, you've got to have some sense of what's going to happen in the future. And President Barron, the idea that we could, in whatever way, give the universities in Florida some understanding that the funding that's coming is whatever's within our power is going to be there, in my view, makes a lot of sense. And we'll give the universities an ability to plan, which is where none of us run on a year-to-year basis, even though that's what we're legally do. We have on February 10th, this committee is meeting at UCF, and we're going to review tuition and fee proposals, so I invite anybody that wants to attend to be there, but the committee will meet then. It's an important meeting, and we'll be talking about a lot of the things that we've just discussed. We will take the recommendations of the February 10th committee meeting to our February 17th board meeting, which I believe is by phone, is it not? It's by phone. Let me also mention that there have been 9 fee proposals and 18 market rate tuition proposals that we'll be talking about. One other thing that's being considered is the University of Florida Board of Trustees is considering block tuition, and I'm not 100% sure that we know where that stands, but we won't be taking up that proposal in the fall. And finally, we've got one regulation we're going to deal with tomorrow, which will amend market rate tuition, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. So with that, unless there are any other questions, any questions? Fine, go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you. Thanks for coming up. Really appreciate your presentation. But I had a question since we were talking about tuition and increases in loans and everything else. I wonder how, I guess, Bright Futures might have impacted minorities and people with limited resource to attend college in reference to accessibility. And I guess, in your opinion, the research that your organization does, I guess, how does the trend look, and then what are some of the things your organization is doing to combat that?
We have always felt that when you raise the standards, whether it's Bright Futures, the SAT requirement going up to 1050, and the GPA requirement going up, that with enough notice, that limited income Hispanic students, African American students, minority students can rise up to the challenge and meet those requirements. That's always been our position. In fact, when we've informed our student network on this particular issue, they actually advocated for the decoupling of Bright Futures from tuition, because they understood that it would result in more need-based aid going into the institutional pot. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but we strongly feel that there's a need to find balance between need-based and merit-based, but we don't think at all that our students cannot rise to the academic challenge. All right.
I'd like to, Governor Perez, are you there?
I'm still here.
Would you like to, any comments for the group?
You know, when we started talking about the financial aid workshop, I think the idea was so that we would get a good understanding of deal with the ability to pay tuition, what they have to do as far as a workload, what's required of them, what their contribution is, and frankly, that equity model that we heard about in the decision making for financial aid. I think all of that was important for years. I appreciate everyone coming to the table, sharing some of that in the process. I think our challenge going forward, starting with our meeting in 3 weeks, is to figure out how that works, what that does, as we look at fee increases in particular, and how that impact will be overlaid upon our students, and whether or not those are with fees and grants that to add to the burden. I think it's been extremely helpful today. Again, I'm sorry I was not able to be there, but thank you so much for sharing that, the process today and tomorrow. I think it was a very worthwhile day. I want to thank Dr. Ehas from UCF for spearheading it from the student affairs side, and certainly the presentation from FSU was enlightening. I think I learned a lot, and I think there'll be a lot of conversations about that. So thanks very much for all of the effort to put this together, and Tim Jones, who put the team together today to make this thing work. Thanks again, Tim, for all your work there as well. This is important, and it has to be in the front of our minds as we make our decisions next month at the February Budget Committee meeting here in Orlando and moving forward.
Thank you very much. We do have one more meeting after this, and so it sounds to me like we're finished, so I'm going to call this committee meeting over, and Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Governor Beard and Governor Perez. We hope that you feel better soon. At this point, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and get started on the trustee nominating committee. Thank you very much.